So my guest today is Sanjeevan Bala, who is Chief Data and AI Officer at ITV and also a non-exec director at FTSE 250 listed Bakkavor. So welcome, Sanjeevan. Thank you very much for joining me on our Boardroom Hot Topics series. I want to roll back at the start a few years ago with why did you decide to take on a non-exec role, given that you still have a very busy day job as an executive?
So I think for me, Tanya, it was about sort of furthering my kind of learning journey, if you will. So I think as an executive, you have a functional role and you play a leadership role. It's within the context of a particular organisation. And for me, what I felt the non-exec opportunity created was the opportunity to kind of look much more horizontally and much more widely across an organisation, but critically start to think about a different sector. So the opportunity to start to join the dots a little bit more. And that's where the non-exec became very much a very logical sort of progression in terms of development, career, as well as learning as well.
Well, absolutely makes sense. And I was going to ask you, what sort of benefits does being a non-exec bring you? And I suppose you've explained some of those. Can you give any examples of things where you've taken that learning from being a non-exec back into your executive job?
Yeah, it's been interesting actually. There's been opportunities to go both ways, if you will. So I think as a non-exec, because you're all exposed across multiple parts of the organisation, so that's everything from the emerging kind of ESG kind of agenda through to how does that then flow through to Remco and remuneration? How do we think about capital allocation in a business? So as you're starting to kind of really think through those things and ensure there's consistency as a non-exec, you very quickly bring some of that thinking and that perspective into your executive role, because as you're then performing your executive roles, you start to think much more horizontally, much more widely about the organisation and the context of the organisation within the ecosystem it plays.
No, that makes sense. And I suppose, and one of the things I say to a lot of the executives looking to accelerate their executive career is take on a non-exec role so that you can see what your board is considering and that wider strategic piece. So I suppose that's what you're saying, it really brings that experience back. I mean, we often talk about the differences in between executive and non-executive and the skill set. How's that been with your transition? Have you found that there are other parts of your skill set you've had to rely on more?
So I think as an executive, I think you hone the skill of communicating and a narrative. So you often, when you're writing the papers, you're leading your boards to a particular answer, a particular solution you're proposing. As you move into non-exec, what's really interesting is if that's your preferred learning style, you're thinking much more differently about this. And so you're so used to, as an executive, writing papers that are sort of leading. So as a non-exec, because you're receiving all of that information, your immediate question and the way you think about this is, well, how am I being led in this particular paper? And how do I think more horizontally and more widely about this particular piece as it relates to the wider strategy? That's quite a transition. You go on quite a journey and move from, having an impact because you're a functional expert or you have a specialism or a journalist in terms of leadership, through to working more collectively with the ExCo and your peer board members to then bring about sort of value creation opportunities within the board. You're observing, you're listening, you're filling in yourself information gaps that you have from the papers, but you don't actually execute anything, right? You don't have control of any of the levers. And you have to develop those relationships with the ExCo to make sure you become much more effective in the role as a non-exec.
Yeah, so it's very much about that soft skill set as well, isn't it? Sort of diplomacy, asking the right questions. And there's lots of adages that people use about critical friends and noses, in, fingers out.
Yep.
So, are there any things you got wrong, Sanjeevan, along the way?
Absolutely. So I think... So my learning style, I'm an experiential learner, so I like to learn by doing, if that makes sense. That's just my natural learning style. So I think when I first started, I think I was probably, or I know I was overly enthusiastic, and I was keen to spend time with the executives to really understand how does this business work. And I think I got advice from both my chair and general counsel around, these are quite busy executives with really full day jobs. And sort of what I realized very quickly is, yes, you get a lot of information from the papers, but actually part of what you need to do as a non-exec is reach out to your wider network to figure out the things you don't know. how do you fill in those information gaps? So I'll give you some examples. The food business I'm on, and there's a lot around, food health and safety, food safety, for example, and a lot of regulatory kind of compliance that's really important for that. Now, on the one hand, you could read a lot of papers, you can spend a lot of time with the executives, but actually, what parts of your network can you tap into to get better understanding of, in very regulated environments, what are the things you need to look for? What are the things you need to watch out for?
That's really interesting, actually, that a lot of the time people talk about having a network to get a non-exec role, which is very important, but utilising your network to give you the support in your role, I think that's a really interesting point. And you also mentioned your chair. Having a supportive chair, I imagine, is pretty key.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, I was incredibly fortunate. We have a very, very supportive chair. He was particularly open to first-time non-execs. And what we put in place effectively is I had a mentor who was our chair of audit and risk, and she became sort of a personal mentor for me as I onboarded. And you can seek feedback in a very safe environment. So what are things you're doing well? What are things you need to dial up and dial down? And they can really help you sort of successfully make that transition. And then the next stage on from there is, well, what sort of non-exec do you want to be?
Yeah. Okay, so what sort of non-exec?
And this gets really interesting, Tanya, because you can be a generalist non-exec, right? So across every aspect of the business, how do you advise? How do you sort of, you can be the sort of the challenger non-exec, right? The contrarian view, the counterfactual argument. So it provokes, insightful questions, but debate and discussion and sort of a controversy, if you will. You can be sort of the innovator, the growth curve, right? So everything potentially you see through the lens of opportunity equally needs to be balanced with risk, right? So I think there's a whole sort of range, I think, once you get into this, where you start to think about, much like your executive career, well, what kind of specialism, what kind of role do you want to play on this particular board as you're sort of going on that journey, and where do you want to end up? And I think that really means you kind of calibrate how you learn, what things you look out for, what things you spot, what you want to bring from your executive career, and critically, how do you start to kind of learn from other more experienced non-execs?
Well, that makes me think of a couple more questions, actually, which is, are there any non-execs that you've seen in action that you've learned from?
There's one particular non-exec on our board, and she's gone plural. And what's really interesting when you observe is she will often reference and talk about the patterns she's seen and observed on her other boards. All of her other boards are in completely different sectors, right? So they're in completely different industries, different business verticals. But what's really fascinating is her ability to kind of pattern match. This is what we observed here. This is what we observed here. This is what I think it means for us. How are we thinking about that? And I've learned so much from how she thinks and how she spots a pattern, crystallizes that theme, brings that in, translates it so it's relevant for the particular industry, the business that you're operating within, and then just seeds out some of the key things you need to think about as you're operating. So that's one that I've just felt there's just an incredible skill in being able to do that. On the other side, when you think about things like risk and compliance, which obviously there is that fiduciary responsibility, is there's other execs that non-execs I've spoken to and worked with where, yes, it's right that you have a risk-based, control-based environment for the corporate governance code, those things, but actually with every risk, how do you start to think about it as an opportunity? And how do you bring the opportunity lens through the role on the board? And I've seen some of the non-execs play that role, and that's a fascinating counterbalance. So those are some examples of sort of different behaviours you observe, and you think about, well, how do I want to calibrate? What sort of role do I want to play? Where do I want to sort of take my own sort of non-exec career?
I think as well, presumably, you have to fit into where the rest of the board is. So if you have other non-execs who are quite focused on risk, you may feel that it's more your role to think about growth and opportunity, and presumably vice versa. So it's also about that board, isn't it? And how you fit into that board and those personalities and their experience.
I think you're right. That there's a lot, I think, also on sort of diverse voices and sort of very distinct, different experience, and that's part of the beauty of your board team, if you will, because each member has had their own executive careers in different industries, different sectors. So I think in many ways, I think you look at the problem statements and the opportunity through a very different set of lenses. And I think that's probably one of the greatest strengths boards can have, where they genuinely create a culture, and this comes down to your chair, where it is a very inclusive, all the voices matter. So you're expected to, and you lean in to contribute to all papers, not just your functional area. And that's when I think you get these different debates where you get the counter view, you get different lenses, different perspectives, different experiences. And I think that's what starts to create sort of the essence of a really effective, productive board.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned there about your own functional expertise. I mean, how do you bring your digital and data and AI knowledge to your non-exec role? How does that play out?
Yeah, so I think pretty much every sector now is looking at, how do you drive efficiencies and growth through data and certainly from artificial intelligence. But I think there's some patterns and themes that always hold true no matter where you are. Now, ultimately, with all this sort of digital and technology innovation, ultimately, in most organizations, it's a people-based transformation, right? It's really a technology transformation. Technology is the easy bit. So in most businesses, I would argue that people are your biggest assets, right? And in manufacturing and food production, we have a large sort of, colleague and people kind of footprint. So a lot of the themes carry across. So how do we think about our employee proposition? How do we think about, as you're driving greater efficiencies in factories, for example, well, what does that mean for the employee proposition? So a lot of the themes definitely carry across. What's interesting, I think, is, the scale and the aspiration and the potential growth opportunities it presents, and how that differs based on your role in the executive versus how you can provide a leadership role in a non-exec capacity.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. And also coming back to the sort of T-shaped approach to being a non-exec, which is functional and obviously that horizontal view and lens. Can I shift a little bit now into asking you about a couple of your extra responsibilities on your board? You are the designated non-executive director for workforce engagement. I was going to say this is a relatively new phenomenon, but actually it's 2018, so I suppose we are a little bit further along. But how do you approach that? What are your responsibilities there?
Yeah, so there's an element that's sort of, the fiduciary set of responsibilities, right? So that's all around ensuring that things like, executive pay are clearly understood and communicated to, the workforce within the organisation. So that's sort of the aspect of kind of regulation compliance. The bigger aspect of the role is ensuring that the voice of colleagues and employees is heard at the boardroom, right? So what a lot of the role entails is spending time in the business. So it's one thing to I often talk about sort of observing the business through PowerPoint. It's very different when you're in a factory, talking to colleagues, living, breathing, seeing it firsthand, and you really got to get into the business to be effective in this particular role. And what you're trying to do is get a feel for their perspective on the organisation, the strategy, what's resonating, what's not quite resonating, where are the things we need to kind of spend, do more on and improve on. And you need to ensure that you crystallise that and bring their voice into the boardroom. The reason it's so important is because increasingly boards are now thinking about the multi-stakeholder environment with which they operate it. Yes, there's the city if you're listed, there's multiple stakeholders from the supplier base, your supply chain, your customers, your employee base. And as you go through boards and you start to look at the various papers, decisions you're making, you need to maybe be able to kind of think through those decisions through those different stakeholder groups. And a designated sort of NED role allows you to bring that voice and that perspective and that sort of understanding as you're thinking through some of those decisions. And that's where it brings a lot of clarity, a lot of value to making sure that's represented, because effectively people are our biggest assets. So how do you ensure that you continue that sort of voice in the boardroom?
Yeah, then, and presumably it takes quite a bit of time. Is there an extra time commitment really there?
So I think to do the role effectively, I think you do need to carve out additional time, and I absolutely spend a lot of time with our chief people officer and spend time on site. So the way it's worked out for me, it's probably through the year an additional sort of 5 to 7 odd days, I'd say on average. And that's a combination of typically a site visit, spending time with colleagues on site, and some of the employee engagement forums, to kind of spend time there and get sort of underneath the skin a little bit more.
So on top of your day job and being a non-exec on this board and being the designated non-executive director for workforce engagement, you're also a member of the ESG committee.
So it's a really interesting model. So the decision we made was to have a separate delegated subcommittee. And I think what you tend to find is typically the board agenda through the year is quite heavy already. And with something like ESG, given the materiality of what all of us need to be thinking about, we felt it was right that there was a subcommittee. And what's really interesting with ESG is there's so much happening at the moment, right? There's so many different sort of guidelines, there's so many targets, there's all these things kind of emerging, and it's an evolving area. And what the subcommittee really does is, one, make sure that there's a common understanding of all the things we're trying to achieve. But critically, what it needs to do is then report back into the main board and create all the linkages. So I'll give you some examples. So you can state aspirations around net zero and all the different targets you might set, and that's fantastic as a statement. What you then need to think about is, well, how do we make sure there's consistency of those things, and how does that flow through to short-term versus long-term objectives? How might you link some of those things to annual bonuses versus long-term incentive plans? How do you then make sure that when we're making decisions in terms of capital allocation, both OPEX and CAPEX, how do you make sure that some of those decisions have consideration towards how is this moving us forward towards net zero, for example? All those things mean it has to be part of the fabric of the entire strategy. It can't just be this ESG thing over there on the side, a bit like CSR back in the day. It can't just sort of sit to the side. It has to be deeply integrated in everything we do. So what the subcommittee does is it ensures there's that deep understanding, again with expertise and external support. It ensures that thing gets fed into audit and risk, gets fed into the main board, and critically ensures that all the board directors have the adequate training and understanding so that we can all play a role in this. So that's really what that committee sort of ensures. We meet about 4 to 6 times through the year. So we add it on as a separate subcommittee, and it meets in collaboration with, in line with our main board meetings.
And it's interesting what you say about there are different approaches that boards take, but it sounds like for your Bakkavor board that this approach is working very well, particularly when you have such a crowded agenda. Is how do you embed sustainability but give it the requisite focus as well?
I think so, and I think it comes into organisational maturity. Where are you? So are you sort of consumer facing? Are you part of the supply chain? That drives a lot of where you sit on that. I think the other aspect is what sort of sector or industry are you? So therefore, how big a challenge might some of the sustainability kind of direction of travel might that be? So if you think about utilities, for example, that's quite a big undertaking if you're in, let's say, oil and gas, right? Whereas if you're in sort of media entertainment, it's probably a lighter footprint and a lighter obligation. So I think depending on where you are, I think you then sit a different approach, and then a subcommittee, part of the main board, part of a different group, I think sort of fits with that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sanjeevan, for joining me today. That was really interesting, and I think very helpful as well for new non-execs, those that are looking to transition into their first role, and particularly one on a FTSE board. I think that would be really helpful. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.